The following Pharma Essentia podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and cannot be considered as medical advice. Please speak to a healthcare professional before making any treatment decisions.
Joshua, bonjour.
Ooh la la, Kay, salut.
And a very special bienvenue.
That's French for welcome.
To our listeners.
Welcome back to the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow.
A podcast about polycythemia vera.
Podcast in French would be...
Podcast.
Brought to you by Pharma Essentia.
Merci, Pharma Essentia.
That means thank you. Okay, now that I'm craving croissants and crepes and baguettes du fromage, what's taking us to France today?
I am very excited about today's episode. And I'm going to stop sprinkling in random French words because I really don't know that many and my French accent is starting to sound quite Russian.
That's a relief to me and I'm sure to our listeners as well.
Today we are talking to Gary Linehan, a lovely gentleman living with PV.
Oh, let me guess. He's French.
Originally from Boston, Allston, Brighton, if you're familiar with the Boston neighborhoods.
Okay, I think I'm still missing something here.
Well, I'm really excited about this conversation because Gary is shedding some light on what it's like to enjoy life to the fullest while living with PV. And for Gary, that means...
I'm an avid hiker, and that's why we're here to talk about the hike on Mont Blanc today.
Oh, that's incredible. What a coincidence. I was just in Chamonix, France, at the base of Mont Blanc, filming a documentary project. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, and I know the hike itself is really quite the challenge. And funnily enough, that other project also involved a group of climbers with a rare disease. Being able to achieve something like that while living with a rare disease means so much to their community. It's all about persevering and overcoming obstacles and proving to yourself and your peers that the rare disease you live with doesn't have to define you or hold you back. Now I'm even more excited for today's episode.
Me too!
But I'm getting a little carried away here, I think. Maybe first we should learn a little bit about Gary and his journey with PV.
Sure. So my name's Gary Linehan. I'm a PV patient. I was diagnosed in 2021, January 2021. I've been an educator for 28 years. I have 2 children and I've been married for 31 happy years.
Gary was diagnosed with PV later in life,
which we know from previous episodes is somewhat common for people living with PV.
I wonder how Gary received his diagnosis.
Like many other patients we've talked to, the road to getting his diagnosis was not straightforward.
Sort of like hiking a trail.
You are not going to believe this, but his diagnosis story actually does involve hiking.
Whoa.
So I've been an avid hiker since probably I was in college. And I used to just hike, the New England woods, New Hampshire, Vermont, looking for waterfalls and swimming holes. And one day, my girlfriend, who is now my wife, said, why don't we start hiking summits? So we started hiking the summits of the White Mountains. I eventually would do all the highest peaks of New England.
That's really, really cool. But wait, what does that have to do with polycythemia vera?
Well, it's interesting. I would say about 2012, 2013, when I was hiking, as I was going down the mountain, I would feel this burning sensation in my toes, but I just assumed it was because I was going down the mountain, my toes were probably bumping into the front of my boots. And it would eventually go away, and when I would take showers, the top of my feet would itch. And I honestly thought it was the athlete's foot. I would treat it as athlete's feet. I would get the powder, I would dry them, I would go through that whole process, and my wife kept saying, there's nothing wrong with your feet. And then in 2020, the burning in my toes would come for no apparent reason. I'd just be sitting or standing, and it would feel like there was a blowtorch at the end of my toes.
Oh my gosh, that sounds really uncomfortable.
Of course, hindsight is 2020. We know that a burning sensation in your extremities is one of the symptoms of PV.
But like with so many rare diseases, it's really hard to pinpoint the problem right away. So how did they figure out it was PV?
So eventually I went to the doctor in the winter, December of 2020. They took some blood tests and it came back with a JAK2 mutation. No idea what that was. I asked a friend of mine at work, he was actually the principal at the time, because his wife was a nurse. I said, Mike, what's a JAK2 mutation? What does that mean? And he knew exactly what it meant. He knew it was cancer, but he said, I don't know, Gary, but it doesn't sound good. Make sure you get it checked out. So I went back to my primary, and she said it was ET, which is essential thrombocytosis, which means an excess number of platelets.
Okay, so we know from previous episodes that a JAK2 mutation refers to a mutation on the JAK2 gene that results in the body creating too many blood cells.
Correct.
But Gary was diagnosed with essential thrombocytosis. I thought he has PV.
He does, which means that, unfortunately, Gary was initially misdiagnosed.
Oh, no.
We're going to hear more from Gary about how he came to his correct diagnosis and how he now lives life fully with PV right after this quick break.
So you're learning about PV on the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow. Now get ready to take the next steps on your PV journey with What's Next PV, an educational site on everything polycythemia vera.
Knowing what's next can help inform the decisions you and your doctor make about the future and is important to your health. What's Next PV can help you understand test results, set goals for the management of your PV, and make a plan to advocate for yourself. Check out www.pvbonemarrow.com to learn more. And we're back.
Thanks for sticking around.
So we just left Gary after he received an initial incorrect diagnosis of essential thrombocytosis.
I gotta know, how did he go from that to getting the correct diagnosis of PV?
I went to a specialist here on Cape Cod, and it was basically a watch and wait approach. That's what this doctor wanted to do. I told my wife that. She didn't want any of that, of waiting and seeing what happens.
I know we've talked about it in the past, but I always love hearing about how the family and the partners of patients can help patients advocate for themselves.
Just another example of a great way a caregiver or a loved one can support someone living with PV.
So she found a specialist at Mass General, Dr. Hobbs. I went up there. She did more blood tests, a bone marrow biopsy to find out exactly what it was. And she said it wasn't ET, it was actually polycythemia vera, which meant I was making too many red blood cells and too many platelets, too many white blood cells, and I had an excessive amount of blood, an abnormal amount of blood in my system.
I'm really glad Gary's wife found a specialist.
I'm sure he is too.
Yeah, and it's a great reminder to bring up something we've said in the past, that you as a patient are always able to seek a second opinion about your diagnosis or your treatment. That must have been so frustrating to receive an incorrect diagnosis. How did Gary react to that?
The fact that I was diagnosed with anything when they said the word cancer, I was honestly angry, because I think I take good care of myself my whole adult life, and I was just like, I had never been on any medications or anything like that. My cholesterol was low. I was really taken aback, and I was very concerned, because that word cancer can be powerful if you let it, and I did for a little while, until I realized that, it was a poet, he said, to live forever is not our victory. So it's the quality of life that I look for now, and not the length of life. And my dad just passed this June, so I feel like the lessons he gave me, the introspection that he had, was a gift to me in moving forward.
So Gary is describing what a few of our other guests have described as well. That anger, that confusion that anyone would face upon receiving a cancer diagnosis.
But he seemed to handle it with quite a lot of grace. I like what he said. Cancer can be a powerful word if you let it. It sounds very similar to other things we've heard on this podcast about focusing on your quality of life after a PV diagnosis. Okay, so when he did receive the correct diagnosis, what did he do then?
At that point, we started phlebotomy therapy. So every 2 weeks, they were taking about a pint of blood out and they just discard it. And I actually felt more energetic after they took the pint out. It was like I felt better. I was much more clear. Symptoms would go away.
I wonder if Gary experienced any road bumps throughout his treatment journey.
Oh, God, I hated needles. I still hate needles. So When I knew that, they told me, oh, it's not as bad, it's actually a bigger needle, which didn't make me feel comfortable at all. But I have to say, again, the people at Mass General were absolutely wonderful. The nurse walked me through this whole process. I mean, she must be used to people like me, of how she was going to do it. And when she was going to put the needle in, I would take a deep breath. So I got close to the phlebotomists that were doing it at Mass General. And I work at a vocational school, so we have a culinary department. And we have these cookies that they make, Neiman Marcus cookies. They're out of this world. And I would bring the phlebotomist team, 24 cookies every time I was going to have phlebotomy. So when I walked in, everybody in the office was happy to see me because they knew I brought cookies. So it was, anything I can do to make people feel comfortable. I'm a good patient. I'm just a big baby when it comes to needles. Not fun at all. But after doing that for about a year, that wasn't really working. My red blood cells counts were still going up. My hematocrit count was still going up. Platelets were still going up.
Quick reminder that your hematocrit is the measure of the volume of red blood cells compared to the total volume of blood in the body.
So we had a very candid conversation about next steps, and she recommended a new sort of interferon. So I trust her implicitly, so that's what I went with.
Interferon is a biologic. According to the National Cancer Institute, interferon naturally occurs in the body and helps the body's immune system fight infection and other diseases like cancer.
I started that in March, late March, and by September my counts were normal. By the following April, counts were great. I was stabilized. In the summer of, 2023, we lowered the dose. I was doing shots twice a month, every 2 weeks, and now I'm doing them every 4 weeks of the same dosage. Things have been going really well for me.
You should always consult with your doctor to specialize your treatment plan to your specific needs. So despite that first initial diagnosis and a bit of a needle phobia, it sounds like Gary has had some really positive experiences with this healthcare team. I bet there are other ways Gary has taken care of himself.
I also try to keep moving. Part of my way of dealing with it, and I've always been active anyway, is making sure that I stay active. So sometimes when I'm exhausted or feeling fatigued, I force myself to get up and go for a walk, go for a hike.
I'm so excited to talk to Gary about hiking, and that's something I didn't even really think about. Fatigue being a major side effect of polycythemia vera must make it so hard to enjoy hiking.
Absolutely, but he is certainly not letting that slow him down.
When I was diagnosed with PV in January of 2021, I decided that I would hike the Long Trail, which is a long through hike through Vermont. It's 273 miles, multiple mountains. I don't even know how many. I think it might be 50 or 60. And when I decided to do it, I decided to do it as a fundraiser for the MPN Association.
Just to remind everyone, MPN stands for myeloproliferative neoplasms, which is a group of diseases that includes PV.
Wow, nice recall, Josh.
I do my best. Let's get back to Gary's fundraising hike.
And we ended up raising close to $10,000. When I hiked, it was July of 2021. It was the third rainiest July in Vermont's history at that time. It's now the fourth, because last year superseded 2021. It rained 18, pouring rain, 18 out of the 23 days I hiked it. But I felt like I couldn't give up because so many people had donated. Former students donated. Former students met me at road crossings and trailheads to give me some trail magic. And what trail magic is when people meet other through hikers at the trailhead, offer them food, water, rides into town, that sort of thing.
That's something I don't think I could ever achieve. 273 miles in pouring rain.
I love what Gary had to say about how his community helped him on. His former students that donated, connecting with the MPN Association. It really does just go to show how much strength you can receive from your support network, even from those who don't have PV. For this hike in particular, Gary brought up his wife's support again.
She's my biggest advocate and biggest supporter. She's always been there, always. I think she knew something was wrong when my feet were burning and it wasn't athlete's foot. She was always like, you need to check that out, you need to check that out. Even my primary care has told me that Jess is my biggest asset as far as my health, because she points out everything I need. When I decided to do the long trail in the summer of 2021, again, that was a big chunk out of her life logistically and supporting me doing that. 18 days of pouring rain can really bring your morale down on the trail, but she was always there with a positive text, or would drive, a couple of 100 miles to meet me at a trailhead, take me to get a shower, get a change of clothes, because I don't know if you know, when you're through hike, you have two outfits. One you hike in, one you sleep in. So every morning you got to put the soaking wet clothes on and the soaking wet socks on, and the soaking wet boots, and just keep going. So it's tough.
On top of all this, Gary's been able to use hiking as a way to connect with other members of the PV community as well.
The following year, in 2022, the MPN Association contacted me and wanted to know if I would do a hike called the Soul to Soul hike in Waterton National Park in Canada. And there was a team of 11 from Canada and 11 from the United States. It was a great experience, really, to connect with other PV patients and learn about their symptoms and our commonalities in our stories and how we all deal with it in our own different ways.
Something I'm noticing about Gary is that he seems to create community wherever he goes. With cookies at the doctor's office, with old friends and students on his hikes in Vermont, and now with other people living with PV on the Soul to Soul hike. I love that he found a way to turn his personality and hobbies into a trail that connects and bonds him with the PV community.
A trail. I see what you did there. We have heard it over and over again. It is so important to have a strong community to support you through your journey with PV.
Who else does Gary get support from?
My brother, he and I did some hiking in Scotland 2 years ago before the Waterton hike, and he's really not a hiker. I don't think he enjoys it that much, but he decided that this was important for him and us to spend some time together. My children have been a huge support. My friends, I got a few close friends that I hike with, and they've been great. They were always ready to go anytime I give them a call. I even met some new friends along the way on one hike last year, doing that same 32-mile hike in the Whites. Last year we met a guy from Philly, and we met up with him 2 weeks ago. He took a train up here, and he did the hike with us this year. And my work has been wonderful. My superintendent, former principal, all very supportive of what I'm doing. I just took a position as the principal of the school this year, and I had a conversation with the superintendent. I'm like, look, I booked this Tour Mont Blanc trip last October. And he's like, no, I want you to go. So just being able to take the time off when school's starting almost as soon as I get back, that's huge.
Mont Blanc! I was so caught up in Gary's story that I forgot we started this whole thing with terrible French accents. Let's talk Mont Blanc. Did you know the French don't pronounce the C? Mont Blanc.
Why don't we let Gary talk about Mont Blanc?
So the Tour Mont Blanc is a 110-mile hike around the mountain of Mont Blanc. So you start in France in Chamonix, and then you hike counterclockwise. So you're going to go through the French Alps, the Italian Alps, the Swiss Alps, back into France. It's a bucket list hike that I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to hike the Swiss Alps. I kept just dreaming about it, putting it off. And then finally, I had a conversation with Jess, my wife, and we were like, let's do it. I originally was going to go hike the Tour Mont Blanc in 2020, but COVID hit. And I wasn't even going to do the whole thing. I was going to do sections of it. But now I get to do the whole 110-mile hike. I'm going with a group. It's a alpine group out of Scotland. So I'll do that with them. There's, people from around the world, mostly the UK, but a couple from Brazil, and I think a couple from Scandinavia, but I can't remember the country.
Gary's been fostering a community, and now he's gone international. I'm so impressed. How has Gary been preparing for this big hike?
So physically, I'm doing a lot more hiking. I hike year round. So I've hiked Mount Washington probably a dozen times in the winter. I just went a couple of weeks ago and went on a 32-mile hike over a couple of days. Mentally, I'm drawing from that deep well that I think we all have, that we all try to access, that we build upon as we mature and grow up, and the support of family and friends.
Can you imagine hiking Mount Washington in the winter 12 times. Mount Washington is the tallest mountain in the Northeast at 6,288 feet, and in the winter, it's known for turbulent weather and extreme winds.
That is some serious hiking. And 12 times, all while battling fatigue, I really can't even imagine. Now, I know from my previous trips with climbers who have rare diseases that the climb can mean so much more than just a climb to them. So what does the hike mean to Gary in terms of living with polycythemia vera?
Living despite our diagnosis or issues, but sucking the marrow out of life.
Was that a bone marrow pun? On our podcast, the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow?
It sure was, Josh.
Man, talking to Gary has been an absolute blast. Does he have any advice for people like him who are living with PV?
I would say, 1, make sure you're seeing a specialist, somebody you trust. 2, find your support network. Find other patients that have it so you can discuss your symptoms, because we really have these symptoms that we look healthy, but there's things going on sometimes, headaches, fatigue, optical migraines, things like that. Burning, itching, but it's good to have a support group of fellow patients that are going through the same thing and have a positive outlook. I think that helps a ton with whatever you're going through.
Really good advice. I hope he reconnects with us after he hikes Mont Blanc. I have to hear how it goes.
Good news.
Could it be?
This is going to be our first 2-parter episode. We will be hearing from Gary again after he completes his epic hike of Mont Blanc.
Yes, part 2.
French for 2?
French for 2. I cannot wait.
Me too. Here comes the outro music, which means we better wrap this up. Thanks everybody for listening to the PV Pod. Be sure to join us for part 2 of this episode to hear how Gary's hike went.
And thank you to Gary for joining us today. It's always so amazing to hear people's experiences as they navigate life with polycythemia vera.
See you next time on the PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow. The PV Pod, Stories from the Marrow is produced by Believe Limited and Bloodstream Media, and made possible thanks to our sponsor, Pharma Essentia. The PV Pod is hosted by me, Kay Vermeil, and my co-host, Josh Bragg. If you like the show, please share it with anyone for whom it might make a difference, and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We'll see you next time.